Hello and welcome to the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Each week, the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in finance take you beyond the numbers and hype, right to the heart of the big issues of the day. This week, we're reflecting on an, at the risk of making rather an understatement, eventful spell in US politics. Donald Trump's success on November 6th followed a campaign built on a platform of extending personal income tax cuts, lower corporate taxes, deregulation, tariffs, immigration controls, and reassessing America's role in global affairs. With the Republicans having also secured control of Congress, the new president will have greater scope to pursue that policy agenda, albeit with a narrow congressional majority. So where does this leave the US, whether in terms of its already large deficit, the potential impact of tariffs, and so on? Well, in a conversation recorded on the 13th of November, as Trump was finalising appointments to his cabinet, we caught up with Kurt Reiman, head of fixed income and co-lead of UBS's ElectionWatch report series, to get a sense of his view on the direction of travel for the US government and economy under the soon-to-be 47th President of the United States. It was a pleasure indeed to welcome Kurt to the show. As mentioned, we spoke on the 13th as the flurry of Trump cabinet appointments and pronouncements was in full flow. Kurt Reiman, first up, can you reflect on those happenings of the 6th of November for us? What did you make of the general election day itself?
Well, we went into the election prepared for all outcomes. The polls were suggesting this was going to be a very tight race, and by all measures, at least on the popular vote, it ended up being a pretty tight race. Except that when you look at the outcome from a electoral map or what happened in Congress, it looks like a pretty decisive victory for the Republicans, who built on the results that they achieved in 2020, where now Donald Trump was able to claim that he won all 7 of the swing states and extended the gains in the Senate so that now it's controlled by the Republicans. It's right now a 2-seat majority, but it could be slightly more than that. And also looks very much on track to be able to sweep Congress with maintaining control of the House of Representatives. It's almost hard to imagine an even better outcome for this administration, for this presidency, for this campaign for Republicans, given the fact that the polls were so close heading into the election.
Well, yeah, and just to that point, Kurt, obviously we spoke with colleagues of yours in the bank over the past kind of few months in the build-up to general election day, and they were talking about the likelihood of different outcomes. And I don't know, obviously a red sweep was, we'd sort of priced up what that might mean, but perhaps certainly I was guilty of not sort of assuming it was going to happen. Now we've likely got that scenario. I don't know, how sort of directly should or could that change, I don't know, investment decisions or, the advice that you and your colleagues give to clients when you talk to them? Because it is a bit of a surprise, but one of the sort of takeaways we often have in this show is like, look, don't make rash decisions on the basis of a political happening or not. Try and stick to the fundamentals. Is it a good moment to remind of that, or does it change things fundamentally?
Yeah. Well, it does change things because the president does have authority over a wide range of issues, especially related to foreign policy. So it will matter. And also the direction that he wants to take all of the agencies of the federal government. You can't take them entirely in the direction that he wants to bring, but has some flexibility and has some maneuvering room. With respect to Congress, it's a little bit more unclear because even if there's a unified government, this Congress might behave like at least some contours of divided government because the majorities are narrow. In the Senate, you need 60 votes to pass legislation because that gets you over the filibuster. So 52, 53 seats, it's not going to completely get you there. And also remember back in the last Congress, it was a Biden administration, so it was a little bit different political constellation in DC, but Trump roughly will have close to the same majority in the House. So that means legislation that passes has to have potentially some Democratic support, definitely, full backing of most, if not all, of the Republicans. And it may force a lot of policy through a procedural course called reconciliation. And that mostly relates to things that are in the budget, so tax and spending items, and that only requires a 50 vote plus one margin in the Senate. So it seems like they'll be able to get a lot of the policy proposals that they have on extending tax cuts through Congress. But then there's another constraint beyond just the majorities, which are thin, and that is the deficit as a share of GDP is twice what it was when Trump took office. So it's a little over 6% versus 3%. And there's just this question as to how willing Congress will be to not only extend the tax cuts from 2017, but all of the other spending and tax priorities that were announced on the campaign trail, which would start to become very expensive and would grow the deficit, which then leads to the third constraint, which is the bond market. If deficits get too big and interest rates rise as a result, it starts to lead down a path of really difficult fiscal math. And so I think of this, yes, as it is unified government, or at least it seems that it's tracking that direction. It was a red sweep. That was our second highest probability case of the four that we were tracking coming into the election. So it's, in that sense, it's not totally a surprise, but it's not a red sweep or such a blowout result that it means that the administration is going to have a blank check on all of the items that it wants to get across the finish line.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a fascinating picture. Let's look at another area which was a real hot topic in the build-up to voting day, Kurt, and that was on sort of trade and tariffs. Again, with the caveat that there are still some undecided factors and some appointments to be made. We've got a pretty good picture of the direction of travel under Trump now. What do you think that the relative decisiveness of the outcome means in terms of the trade and tariffs picture? I guess he has a stronger kind of whip hand maybe to push things further than he might otherwise have been able. Is that the kind of the summation of it?
It is. This is worth probably 4 or 5 podcasts, just this topic alone. What I'd say, kind of top level would be this second Trump administration is carrying on what has now been 8 years of a national industrial policy with tariffs at the core that was introduced when Trump took office in 2016. The Biden administration continued the tariffs on China, ramped them up in 2024, introduced all sorts of legislation that was non-tariff, started to rely more on subsidies. But the focal point was, pulling at the string of the fabric that had been, sewn between the U.S. and China, and sort of de-emphasizing trade with China and emphasizing the U.S. manufacturing capabilities and protections on important technology and security interests for the United States. And in that sense, there's a certain of a carrying on of the prior policy. But the prior policy under the Biden administration was also multilateral engagement with allies. And I think what we're going to be moving back towards is this transactional isolationism that the Trump administration displayed during the first administration, one that is going to be focused on what the administration perceives as imbalanced trade or taking advantage of certain, international rules and norms that may disadvantage, at least in the administration's eyes, the United States. And really, this is also an administration that takes office. They built a multiracial working class coalition. That's how this administration got elected. So it has to answer, in a sense, to that need for real income growth, greater economic security for workers in rural areas and in the heartland of the country that may have felt left behind. So that, in a sense, could be a constraint on just how aggressive trade policy is. But make no mistake, this is an administration that is going to propose tariff increases and a range of sanctions and inbound and outbound investment controls and export controls against China and a range of countries that it perceives as really just kind of engaging in international trade in an unfair way or creating a risk to U.S. security interests. So that could take the form of higher tariffs against China. There may be a focus on the EU. There's a lot of talk about digital services taxes that have been growing in Europe, and the administration may want to take aim at that. Cars that are entering Mexico that are connected vehicles, it's perceived as potentially a security threat from China that the U.S. administration may want to curtail. There's a whole rewrite potentially, or at least a review of the USMCA that is coming in 2026. So I think our mind should be trained on getting back to these bilateral trade relationships, and the administration at first proposing negotiating propositions of let's get to this point, and if not, then we may use the threat of tariffs to get us there. The problem with that is that even though this administration is prepared to enact tariffs, other countries are prepared to retaliate. And that's the, if you will, the risk that's ahead of us in the next 4 years that we got a glimpse of in 2018 and 2019.
Yeah, the potential for those retaliatory measures are absolutely fascinating. If we talk about climate crisis, sustainability agenda, we know that's not a priority of Trump sort of personally in ideological terms. A little early to second guess moves or lack of moves or retrenchments in this area, Kurt. But I did think I would ask you about it. Do you have a sense of, I don't know, is it sectors that are particularly vulnerable? It might be green energy, EVs, we know he's very sceptical about, but what we should expect maybe to be looking out for, I guess, in the weeks and months ahead in terms of the climate and the sustainability agenda?
This administration is going to move towards a greater production and potentially export of U.S. fossil fuels. And what I hear is the value of having low energy prices. So if you get back to the concerns of hourly or manufacturing workers who haven't experienced much in the way of real wage gains, one thing you can do is reduce the price of energy, and that may be seen as a win for manufacturing activity in the United States because, a lot of industrial processes involve high amounts of energy. And so does that advantage the U.S.? Does it advantage the average worker because less of the paycheck is going to pay for energy? That's all fine, but lower energy costs may not necessarily be what energy companies want to see happen. And they've been exercising capital discipline and really kind of regulating the amount of investment that goes in so as to not see a sharp decline in the price of the commodities that they're producing. On the renewable side, again, I think there's also a question as to just how far the administration can go in reversing some of these key provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, because those subsidies to generate solar and wind and other power sources nationally is spending in congressional districts. That matters. That matters to members of Congress. And so just how many senators and members of the House of Representatives are going to line up to vote for a repeal of funding that has been aiding economic activity in their states remains to be seen. There is, though, however, and this all kind of cycles through, we were talking about personal income tax cuts. Well, if you want to get those across the board, that's $4 trillion. Well, how can you get it so it doesn't impact the deficit? Well, you can cut spending. The IRA spending, Inflation Reduction Act spending may be one avenue that they could go. They've also been proposing including revenue from an across the board or universal tariff of, say, 10 or 20%. That hasn't been done in a very long time. It's very difficult procedurally, but just to say that extending tax cuts is not neutral. It has a budgetary impact and it worsens the deficit. So finding sources of either lost revenue or revenue that you hadn't collected before in the form of tariffs or spending cuts can help get more elected officials in Congress to come on board and agree to any range of either extensions of tax cuts or new tax cuts. And that's that whole math and calculus around the support and the procedures and how they'll get that done. That's all being thought about right now, but it's too early to say exactly how that's going to be staged and what avenue it's going to take.
Well, yeah, and just one, perhaps a final thought, Kurt, just on sort of efficiencies and savings. Lots of narrative, and again, we had it from Elon Musk, who obviously has this sort of new portfolio in this administration, seemingly. Some of these pledges or ideas that he postulated, I could save $2 trillion off the budget if I was in charge, and looks like he'll sort of have some kind of portfolio to look at that. I mean, let's be honest, some of these numbers are a little fanciful, aren't they? And this is before we even get into some of the pragmatics of it, which you've already described in terms of getting enough buy-in from stakeholders. Just some of these targets, nominal numbers, then they're not super helpful. But do you think there is a genuine appetite to, I don't know what you want to call it, rid the capital of bureaucracy and, slash red tape, all these kind of trite expressions we get? Can that really move the needle as far as some are suggesting?
Well, there's this whole idea of the paradox of thrift. If you, maybe that's not applying here because it's more for savings of individuals. But if you cut too much government spending, if you become too efficient too quickly, then perhaps that ends up leading to worse economic outcomes, which can then feed on themselves. And if the whole goal is to support the incomes of everyday hardworking Americans, then cutting government spending so much that it sacrifices this pretty decent economy that we have right now, the growth anyway, then that might be counterproductive. But at the same time, we've heard so much about the potential labor saving advantages and productivity enhancements that you could get from artificial intelligence and the investments that are made there. And could you perhaps use artificial intelligence or blockchain technology to help to make some cuts and to save some money, government bureaucracy? And I believe that this administration, with some of the appointments that have been made or have yet to be made, but the people who are on the short list are going to pursue this because this administration has friends now in Silicon Valley. And they understand how the technology works and will be working to apply it. So I don't necessarily think of this as the kind of old school style as we think about it, the cutting spending, eliminating jobs just across the board, or some percentage spending cuts. I think it may be more of an approach that tries to bring new technologies to bear, as you're also seeing in the private sector, to yield some efficiency advantages. So that to me is interesting. I'd be watching it. Do too much though, that's the kind of be careful what you wish for. Do too much and you may end up with, at least for a period of time, a worse economic outcome. And based on some of the things that I'm hearing from key nominations, that's not the direction that his cabinet wants to head in just out of the gate.
And that's Kurt Reiman bringing us to the end of this edition of the Bulletin with UBS here on Monocle Radio. Listen again, explore and subscribe to the magazine at monocle.com. You can also follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. And you can discover more and find out how UBS can help you at ubs.com. If you search ElectionWatch at ubs.com, you'll find plenty more materials and resources from Kurt and his colleagues. This is the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. I'm Tom Edwards. Thanks for listening.